What did Oxford University really look like in the 1960s? Britain? In 1960, women made up less than 15% of Oxford students and needed written permission to visit a man's room. But here's the extraordinary thing. This medieval fortress was cracking open through a collision between champagne tradition and working-class ambition. The same dining halls produced both radical socialists and conservative prime ministers, creating a paradox that defines Britain today. You're about to discover the blueprint for understanding Britain's elite. Walking through Oxford's cobbled streets in 1960, you'd have stepped through a time machine. Students hurried between lectures wearing billowing black academic gowns. Not for special occasions, but every single day. This wasn't optional. It was enforced by bulldogs, the university proctors who prowled the streets after dark, checking that undergraduates wore their gowns and were safely tucked away before college gates clanged shut at midnight. Mornings began with chapel bells calling students to prayers, not optional for many colleges. Breakfast in hall meant sitting on long wooden benches beneath portraits of long-dead benefactors. The high table, raised above common students, was where dons sat, quite literally looking down on their charges. Latin grace echoed through these halls. Benedictus benedicat, while students stood in respectful silence. The tutorial system was delightfully archaic. One-on-one sessions with world-renowned professors who might serve you sherry at 11 in the morning whilst dissecting your essay with surgical precision. One former student recalled his tutor keeping a loaded revolver in his desk drawer, occasionally taking it out to emphasize points about Aristotle. Social codes were Byzantine in complexity. The right tie, the right accent, the right school, all mattered desperately. Students from Eton or Harrow recognized each other instantly, forming invisible networks lasting lifetimes. For them, Oxford was simply finishing school for running the country. College life revolved around ancient rituals. Formal halls happened nightly, with students required to attend a certain number per term. The food was notoriously awful. Grey meat, overcooked vegetables, and pudding that could double as industrial sealant. Yet the silver was real, wine flowed for those who could afford it, and the sense of being part of something ancient was intoxicating. Rules for female students were particularly medieval. The few women's colleges, Somerville, Lady Margaret Hall, St Hugh's, St Hilda's and St Anne's, operated like convents. Men could visit only between certain hours, never in bedrooms. Room checks happened nightly. One Somerville student remembered literally climbing walls to avoid the porter after staying out past curfew. Getting caught meant rustication, Oxford's polite term for temporary expulsion. Before we dive deeper into this extraordinary world, if you're fascinated by untold stories of Britain's past, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. Because what's coming next about the women who dared challenge this male fortress will blow your mind. By 1963, something was shifting in Oxford's ancient foundations. The Conservative government's expansion of university places meant more grammar school boys were arriving, clutching state grants and feeling like they'd wandered into someone else's party. These scholarship boys, brilliant enough to earn their place but constantly reminded they didn't belong. Dennis Potter, who'd arrived from a Forest of Dean mining family, wrote about feeling like a kind of secret agent, observing the upper classes like an anthropologist. The culture shock was profound. Working-class students arrived not knowing what sub-fusk meant, let alone owning the required dark suit and academic cap. They'd never encountered anyone with a valet or understood why some students never worried about exams. College scouts, Oxford's term for cleaners and servants, often showed more kindness to these outsiders than fellow students. Many scouts were local townspeople who'd seen generations of toffs come and go. They'd discreetly explain which fork to use, how to address a don, when to wear which gown. One grammar school student recalled his scout leaving a proper dinner jacket on his bed before his first formal hall, knowing he couldn't afford one. Women faced different but equally daunting challenges. By 1965, 5 men's colleges admitted women for graduate studies only, but undergraduate life remained strictly segregated. Female students were brilliant, they had to be, given how few places existed, but were treated like curiosities. Male dons would address lectures entirely to men, as if women were invisible. One female student remembered her tutor suggesting she was taking a place from a man who'd make better use of it. Sexual politics were extraordinary. Women who dated were fast, those who didn't were frigid. The contraceptive pill had arrived, but college doctors wouldn't prescribe it to unmarried women. Getting pregnant meant immediate expulsion for the woman only. The man might receive a stern talking to, but his academic career continued unaffected. Yet these outsiders brought what Oxford desperately needed: fresh perspectives and raw hunger for knowledge. Working-class students worked twice as hard, knowing this was their only shot. They formed their own networks, bonding over shared experiences of not fitting in. The Labour Club swelled with new members who actually knew what manual labour looked like. Debates at the Oxford Union began featuring voices that didn't all sound like they'd emerged from the same prep school, bringing genuine diversity of thought to ancient chambers. Speaking of change, if you're enjoying these insider stories about Britain's elite institutions, share this video with someone who'd appreciate knowing the truth behind those dreaming spires. The contrast between Oxford and the outside world became increasingly surreal as the decade progressed. In London, Carnaby Street exploded with colour. The Beatles conquered America, and young people were changing how humans dressed and thought. Meanwhile, Oxford students still attended 9 o'clock lectures in medieval gowns, addressed tutors as "Sir", and requested permission to be absent for a single night. But the modern world was seeping through ancient stones. By 1965, Oxford had beat clubs hidden in college cellars. The Carfax Club hosted bands who'd later become legends. The Who played there in 1965 for just £30. Students would attend formal hall in academic robes, then slip away to dance to the Rolling Stones in damp basements, still wearing white bow ties under psychedelic lighting. Drug culture arrived quietly, but persistently. Cannabis smoke drifted from college windows, though everyone pretended not to notice. LSD appeared at certain parties, with students claiming it helped understand Coleridge better. One student recalled his entire staircase taking mescaline before a philosophy lecture, resulting in what he described as the most profound discussion of Descartes that never actually happened. Fashion became a battlefield. Miniskirts caused apoplexy among proctors. One brave St Hilda's student wore hot pants to a lecture and was sent home to change, but returned in an even shorter skirt, arguing it was technically within regulations. Male students growing longer hair led to battles with authorities insisting gentlemen should look like gentlemen. The compromises were hilarious. Hair could touch the collar, but not cover it. The music scene was revolutionary. College bands formed everywhere, playing in centuries-old dining halls that previously only heard classical quartets. The Oxford University Jazz Club brought American blues musicians who played to packed audiences of students who'd never seen a black person perform live before. The contrast between raw, emotional performances and the buttoned-up environment was electric. Dating culture was transforming, though Oxford resisted. Mixed-sex parties required written permission with chaperones present. But students found ways around every rule. They'd book restaurants for dining societies that were actually romantic dinners. Punting on the Cherwell became the summer activity of choice, practically the only way unmarried couples could be alone without breaking regulations. The town gown divide became more pronounced as students embraced counterculture. Local townspeople, many working in colleges, watched bewildered as students they served at breakfast demonstrated against Vietnam by afternoon. The collision between privileged students playing at Revolution and working-class locals who needed their jobs created tensions that occasionally erupted into fights outside pubs, highlighting the strange duality of radical politics within ancient privilege. The year 1968 marked Oxford's political awakening. Though in typical Oxford fashion, even revolution came with Latin mottos and formal procedures. The trigger was global. Paris was burning, American campuses were in uproar, and Oxford students suddenly realised they were part of an international movement, not just inhabitants of a privileged bubble. The Vietnam War became the focal point. Students organised sit-ins at the examination schools, the first time American-style protests had disrupted Oxford's sacred academic rituals. The authorities didn't know how to respond. How do you maintain 8 centuries of dignity when students are chanting, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" in your medieval quadrangle? The Oxford Revolutionary Socialist Students' Group emerged, led by charismatic Tariq Ali, who'd become one of Britain's most prominent left-wing intellectuals. They organised a massive demonstration marching from Oxford to the American Embassy at Grosvenor Square in London. The sight of Oxford students, many still wearing elements of academic dress, confronting police horses, became an iconic image of the era. But Oxford protests had peculiar character. The occupation of the Clarendon building included formal debates with proper rules of order. Students voted on whether to allow journalists in, appointed committees for negotiations, and arranged cleaning rotas. One participant later remarked it was the most well-organised revolution that never actually happened. The Rhodes Must Fall campaign had its earliest roots here, though it wouldn't fully emerge for decades. Students began questioning why they walked past statues of colonial oppressors daily. South African apartheid became a huge issue, with students demanding the university divest from companies operating there. The debates were fierce. Many students were heading to lucrative careers in exactly those companies. College politics became revolutionary. Students demanded representation on governing bodies, challenging the absolute authority of dons who'd ruled unchallenged for centuries. Some colleges experimented with joint committees, though the sight of undergraduates sitting as equals with professors who taught for 40 years was too much for many traditionalists. The Oxford Union, that training ground for future politicians, became a circus of radical politics. Debates that traditionally featured future Conservative cabinet ministers now included Marxists, anarchists, and feminists. The famous chamber that had hosted Gladstone and Macmillan now rang with calls for permanent revolution. The old guard was horrified but couldn't stop it. The democratic principles they taught were being used against them. Sexual politics entered mainstream conversation. The first women's liberation meetings happened in college rooms, planning campaigns for equal access to all colleges, equal treatment in tutorials, and ending absurd regulations governing female students' social lives. These weren't polite requests anymore. They were demands backed by organised action that would reshape Oxford's future. The social stratification at Oxford in the 60s was so complex it required a PhD to navigate. At the top sat the Bullingdon Club, whose members included future prime ministers and cabinet ministers who thought nothing of spending more on a single dinner than most students received in a term's grant. Their signature move was trashing restaurants, then leaving enormous cheques to cover damages, a practice that continued well into the modern era. The May balls, actually held in June because Oxford, were displays of excess that would make Gatsby blush. Tickets cost £15 when the average student grant for a term was £60. Champagne flowed in literal fountains. Bands were imported from London, fireworks lit up the medieval skyline, and students danced until dawn in white tie and ball gowns costing more than a car. One brass-nose ball in 1967 featured an actual circus, complete with elephants. But for every champagne-soaked aristocrat, 20 students nursed pints in the Eagle and Child, known as the Bird and Baby, where Tolkien and C.S. Lewis had held their Inklings meetings. These pubs were democratic spaces where the grandson of a duke might argue philosophy with a miner's son over warm beer. The King's Arms became notorious for late-night debates that started about essays and ended about the meaning of existence. The Piers Gaveston Society threw parties that would make today's students blush. Named after Edward II's supposed lover, it was Oxford's most notorious drinking society, where cross-dressing was mandatory and discretion was everything. Future judges, politicians, and media moguls would spend evenings in cocktail dresses and fishnets, creating blackmail material that bonded them for life. College rivalries were intense and often absurd. Balliol men considered themselves intellectually superior to everyone. Christchurch men thought Balliol was trying too hard, and everyone looked down on Keble for being too new, founded 1870, and too red brick. These rivalries played out in everything from rowing competitions to academic results to who could drink the most port without vomiting. The dating scene was bizarre, even by 60s standards. Common balls were essentially marriage markets where suitable matches were engineered between students from appropriate backgrounds. Parents would actually travel to Oxford to vet potential partners. Meanwhile, others experimented with free love in bedsits on the Iffley Road, though discretion was essential. Being caught in a compromising situation still meant rustication. Dining societies proliferated: the gridiron, the phoenix, the archery club, each with rituals, dress codes, and informal hierarchies. Membership was by invitation only, and the right invitation could set up your entire career. These weren't just social clubs, they were networking organisations that would place members in positions of power for the next 50 years. The Oxford generation of the 1960s reads like a who's who of British establishment for the next half-century. Tony Blair arrived in 1972, just catching the tail end of this era. Theresa May was at St Hugh's from 1974. The paradox is striking. The same institution, in the same decade, produced both radical socialists who wanted to tear down the system and conservative politicians who wanted to preserve it. The media landscape of Britain was essentially colonised by 1960s Oxford graduates. The BBC, The Guardian, The Times, Channel 4 all became dominated by people who'd cut their teeth at the Oxford Union or editing Cherwell. They brought not just shared references, but a particular way of seeing the world that assumed everyone had read the same books, knew the same people, understood the same cultural codes. The tutorial system created a generation supremely confident in their ability to master any subject quickly. This produced brilliant generalists who could write about anything with authority, whether they knew about it or not. It's why British journalism still has that particular tone of assumed expertise that can be either illuminating or infuriating. The women who fought through Oxford's discrimination in the 60s became the pioneering generation that would finally break significant barriers. They entered law, medicine, politics, and academia with chips on their shoulders and points to prove. Margaret Thatcher, though from an earlier generation, had experienced the same Oxford sexism, and her particular brand of aggressive conservatism was partly shaped by having to be twice as good as any man just to be heard. The working-class students who survived Oxford's class warfare brought something different. They knew how to code switch between Britain's divided cultures. Many became interpreters between the establishment and everyone else, though the psychological toll of constantly translating between two worlds shaped their politics in complex ways. The network effects are still visible today. Look at any British institution, the Cabinet, the BBC, major newspapers, the judiciary, and you'll find Oxford graduates from this era or their direct protégés in key positions. They hire each other, promote each other, marry each other, and ensure their children follow the same path. But perhaps the most lasting legacy is how 1960s Oxford embedded inequality into meritocracy. Yes, more working-class students could attend, but they had to become culturally middle-class to succeed. Yes, women could compete, but they had to outperform men while following rules men had written. The system opened just enough to claim it was fair while maintaining enough barriers to ensure real power stayed concentrated in remarkably few hands. This Oxford paradox, an institution that simultaneously represents the best and worst of British society, was crystallised in the 1960s and defines us still. The Oxford of the 1960s wasn't just a university experiencing change. It was a pressure cooker where Britain's entire class system was being challenged, defended, and ultimately reformed just enough to survive. Those students lounging on manicured lawns, arguing in ancient pubs, and dancing in candlelit halls would shape every aspect of British life, carrying both revolutionary ideals and institutional prejudices absorbed during those transformative years. Understanding what really happened behind those college walls isn't just historical curiosity. It's essential to understanding why Britain works the way it does today, why certain voices dominate our national conversation, and why real change remains as elusive as a porter's permission to stay out past midnight. If you've enjoyed this journey through Oxford's most transformative decade, subscribe for more untold stories of British history. Hit the notification bell and share this with anyone who thinks they know what really went on behind those dreaming spires. Cheers for watching.